Hi guys, it's Bridget. Today's video is going to be my August wrap up. I'm a little behind getting this video out and I'm realizing that I need to start taking notes while I'm reading because I didn't do that this time, and when I went back to see what books I read, it's been like over a month for some of them and I had trouble kind of remembering what my thoughts were. I ended up reading 8 books and about 2,600 pages, which is a pretty average month for me. I'm just gonna go through this list in the order that I read them. First book that I read was Sourdough by Sloan. I gave this book 5 stars. It was such a feel-good read. The story follows our protagonist Lois, who codes robotic arms in San Francisco, and she is generally just overworked, lonely, and kind of disconnected from her life. One day she comes across a random takeout flyer and she orders this spicy soup and sourdough bread from these 2 brothers, and she immediately falls in love with the food and she forms a friendship with the owners of this business. Eventually they end up closing the business and they leave her their sourdough starter. From there, Lois begins making her own sourdough bread for the first time, and she's discovering this passion for this new hobby, and along the way she starts to realize that there is more to this starter than meets the eye. The book itself is so wholesome. The whole time that I was reading it, I was just craving sourdough bread, and it made me feel like I could become a baker too. Lois as a character was so relatable and so likable, and I loved that there was the perfect balance of magical realism thrown into this story to make it unique and interesting. I would definitely recommend this book to anyone who's looking for a quick, just fun and easy read. The next book that I read in August was Shadows of Self by Sanderson. This is the second book in the Alloy era Mistborn spin-off series, and while it was a really fun read, it was definitely my least favorite so far of the Mistborn books. I ended up giving it 4 stars, which obviously is still pretty good, but it was not my favorite of the series. I kept trying to think about what it was about this book that made it not as good as the other ones to me, and I really just can't put my finger on it. It just felt kind of slow. But if you are reading the Mistborn series, this was by no means a bad book. The action was still there, the mystery was good, and the stakes did continue to get higher throughout the book. And while I do love reading about Wax and Wayne and their adventures, I am hoping that the next installment of the series is a little bit better. The third book that I read in August was Follow Me to Ground by Sue Rainsford. I actually have a full review for this book up on my channel that I did last month, so if you have not already checked it out, go do that now. As a brief summary, I gave it 5 stars. It was super creepy and atmospheric and a really fun read. Definitely great for anyone who likes books that are a little out there. The next book that I read was Burial Rites by Hannah Kent. And this is a book that was sitting on my shelf for so long, and I am so glad that I finally picked it up. It was definitely a 5-star read for me. This is the story of Agnes Magnus' daughter, who was accused and convicted of murdering her former master and sentenced to beheading. She is sent to spend the rest of her days on a farm to live and work until she awaits her execution. The story is told from alternating points of view. Sometimes you hear the point of view from the wife of the family who lives on the farm. Sometimes you hear it from the priest who is coming to hear her final rites, and sometimes you see the first-person perspective of Agnes herself. These different perspectives really helped develop the characters so well and kept me drawn into their lives and their stories. The author also just did a fantastic job of creating these beautiful descriptions of life in Iceland, and it really just added this vivid imagery to the story. This ended up actually being a much more emotional and depressing read than I thought it was going to be, but I actually did end up shedding a tear at the end of it, and I'm positive that anyone who likes historical fiction would love this book. The next book that I read was Get a Life, Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert. This was such a cute contemporary romance. I gave it 4 stars. I had been hearing so much about this book, and because I'm trying to get into romance a little bit more, I thought I would pick it up and give it a shot, see if all of the hype was justified. And overall, it actually ended up being very cute. The story follows Chloe, who is a 20-something-year-old living with chronic pain, and because of this, she has kind of shut herself off from the world and is living a very no-risk life. At the very beginning of this book, she has a near-death experience, and it causes her to rethink how she's been living her life. She ends up making a bucket list of experiences she needs to have in order to get a life. Enter our male protagonist, Red, who is the superintendent of the apartment complex that she lives in. He's an artist who has recently gotten out of a bad relationship and has a lot of emotional baggage, and he's kind of trying to put his life back together. Chloe and Red's relationship ends up being your typical enemies to lovers trope, and it is full of witty banter and lots of sexual tension. I really loved Chloe and Red's individual personalities and the way their personalities meshed together, and I really loved how the chapters switched between their perspectives. I will say though, I was completely taken off guard by how explicit this book ended up being. Based off of the cover, I was expecting like a more lighthearted romance, but there were a lot of R-rated scenes in here, so just keep that in mind if you're going to pick this up, if that's something that you like or not. The next book that I read was a short novella, The Empress of Salt and Fortune by Nevo. I picked this book up on a whim last month, and I'm so glad that I did. It was a beautiful story, and I ended up giving it 5 stars. This is an Asian-inspired story that kind of has the vibe of like a traditional oral storytelling. It's categorized as a fantasy on Goodreads, but having read it, I really wouldn't classify it that way. It's more like a fable than true fantasy. The story starts with a cleric named Chi coming across an old woman named Rabbit, who in her youth was a handmaiden to the infamous Empress Nghi, who was exiled shortly after her marriage to the Emperor. Rabbit recounts her friendship with the Empress, and in doing so, reveals the story of the strength and resilience of women who spend their entire lives being undervalued and tossed aside. This book had a sense of nostalgia and longing to it that made me really emotional, and it actually ended up being a really unexpected, beautiful read. The next book that I read in August was The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie, and I have been looking forward to this book so much, and it actually ended up being kind of a disappointing read. I gave it 3.5 stars. I think the issue was more with me though than the book. I was really busy at the time, and I kept only reading like 20 pages here and there. I just didn't have the time to immerse myself in the story. Once I did have time though to sit down and read a big chunk at once, I did enjoy it much more than I had been. The book itself follows several different characters, but there are 3 main ones that are sort of the most important. You have Logan, who is an infamous barbarian warrior who is just trying to live another day, and he ends up traveling with the wizard Bayaz. There is also Giselle Dan Luther, who is this young, arrogant officer in the Royal Army who is training to compete and win in this fencing competition. His main motivation is that he just wants to make a name for himself. And finally, there is Inquisitor Glocka, who used to be a famed swordsman and soldier, but in his youth he was captured by the enemy in battle, and he was tortured and crippled, and now he acts as the torturer slash inquisitor for his own nation, and really he just is bitter towards the world. My main issue with this book was that it felt like a long prologue. Not much really happens, but to be fair, you do really get to know each of the characters and their motivations really in depth. By the end of the book, I felt like I knew them all really well. And honestly, even though this was not my favorite fantasy book that I've ever read, I am eager to jump into the next one in this series because I feel like this first book really set up the story well, and I'm excited to see where it goes from here now that the groundwork is laid. The last book that I squeezed in August was Scythe by Neal Shusterman. This was such a great end to the month. I gave it 4.5 stars. I had just heard so many things about this series, and so many people love them, so I'm so glad that it didn't disappoint. The concept of this book was so unique, and I just loved exploring the implications of living in a future where every human hardship has been conquered, including death. Because people don't die anymore, the population needs some way of being controlled, so society has created a group called Scythes who can perform these sanctioned killings and keep the population under control. Most Scythes take this very seriously, and they have a code of ethics that they follow, and they perform their killings with a lot of reverence. Others though, they take a more extravagant approach and they live life as celebrities. They perform these mass killings, and they generally just live a life of luxury. The general population is afraid of Scythes, but they have the impression that they are incorruptible. Our 2 main characters in this story become Scythe apprentices, and they begin to learn that the Scythedom maybe is not as incorruptible as it seems. I really enjoyed this book. I read it so fast, but I did knock off 0.5 star because I kind of wish that it was written as an adult book and not YA. I feel like it could have gone to really dark, interesting places if it was marketed towards adults more. That's just my own personal preference though. I tend to like adult fantasy and sci-fi more than YA, and I am still super excited to pick up the next book in this series. Let me know if you guys have read any of the books that I highlighted in this wrap up. I had a really great time reading all of them. There weren't really many disappointments this month. I feel like I started a bunch of great new series and I cannot wait to keep reading them and keep seeing where these stories go. If you enjoyed this content, please do remember to like and subscribe. Otherwise, I will see all of you in the next video.